Welcome to the Refurbishment Mastery podcast with me, Martin Rapley. If you're a property investor who is worried about paying too much for your next property, concerned that you don't know how to manage a refurb, or scared that you will be ripped off by a builder, then this is for you. In this podcast, I share over 30 years of experience of managing refurbishments and conversions to help you make more profit, save your time, and ultimately enjoy the process. On with the podcast.
In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about something that is really, really important, which is your obligation to deliver your project safely. Now, I'm not actually a qualified health and safety advisor. I was qualified to a certain extent a good number of years ago, but legislation has moved on and it's not something that I've chosen to remain qualified in. However, I can explain to you your obligations with respect to safely delivering your project. And I can certainly recommend that you should be taking some advice from a qualified health and safety advisor as part of your delivery of your project. So what I'm going to cover off in this episode is an overview of your obligations, the importance of understanding those obligations, and a few reminders that you need to get yourself some external support from a specialist, from a qualified specialist that can help you with this. Now, what I'm covering here is what you've probably heard of called the CDM regulations. Now, the CDM regulations doesn't sound anything like health and safety in any respect, but it actually is. And it's a typical piece of government legislation that's perhaps not describing what it actually does. However, the regulations, which have been in place now for probably 30 years or so, in one format or another, are reasonably easy to follow, to be honest, and they're reasonably clear if you want to read them. But I'm not suggesting that you do read them. I'm suggesting, as I've said already, that you take some advice from someone who can help you understand them and actually implement them. So CDM regulations, CDM stands for Construction, Design and Management. And this is with respect to construction operations that are carried out. Now, when these regulations first came out, and as I say, that was probably back in the 1990s somewhere, I don't really know how far back that was, there was a bit of a grey area with them in the early days, and there was an inference from them in the early days that if you were a property investor, they didn't apply to you. However, in 2015, there was an overhaul of the regulations. And as part of that overhaul, it became absolutely categoric, 100% clear that property investing does now fall under the regulations. And the reason for the grey areas is even now, there's different regulations if someone is working on your own house as opposed to someone working on one of your investment properties. So, and under the previous drafting, there was this lack of clarity between the difference between your own house and investment property. What the regulations now say is that if you are undertaking anything from a commercial perspective, i.e. to make money, which clearly is where we are as property investors, then the regulations apply to you. So that kind of clears that up. There is no way to avoid these regulations now since this redrafting in 2015, which, as I say, as part of that redraft, they've also made it simpler to follow, simpler to understand. And what I'm going to do in this podcast is just unpack the basics for you, because as I've qualified already, I'm not qualified to give you the nitty-gritty, but I can at least give you the basics. So we're talking about the safe delivery of our project from three perspectives: the C, construction, the D, design, and the M, the management. Now, in some respects, those three words are in the wrong order, because normally we would consider the design first, and this part of the regulations effectively says that the design of the project needs to consider how we build it safely, but also how we live in it safely as well. And if we take a really simple little example here, and you may well be aware of some of these things in some of your properties, but when we design a building now, when our architects design a building, although obviously it's not always architects, it's us steering some of the design, we need to consider how we live in it, how we manage it safely, how we build it safely going forward. And so a really simple little example is I'm sure a number of you have got properties where there's a light bulb that could blow over the staircase, and it's really hard to get access to that light bulb if it does blow. You have to rig up some ladders on the staircase. It's really tricky, and you can picture people balancing off the banisters and trying to replace the light bulb. Well, the CDM regulations basically say that's unacceptable, that's unreasonable. We shouldn't be forcing people to live in our properties where if the light bulb blows, we run the risk of falling down the stairs trying to replace it. So now we need to consider at the basic level, where do we put the lights so that if the light bulb or when the light bulb blows, we can actually safely get to it. And you've perhaps seen lights being put sensibly on the landing area, and maybe you've used spotlights to angle them onto the staircase. You've perhaps seen wall lights on the staircase on half landings where we've got a flat deck and we can put a set of steps to safely get up there and change the lights. But our obligation as owners of the properties is to ensure that the design considers things like that. Now, in reality, what we're all doing as fairly run-of-the-mill residential properties, anything you outsource to an architect to design, they will already have considered all of these. We're not doing anything super complicated. Where architects need a lot more support is on complex buildings, on commercial buildings, on public buildings and things like that. But architects are well aware of this legislation relating to residential properties, and as a result, they won't really have any difficulty designing your property to be compliant. But that's the first element of CDM. How do we design things in a way that they are safe to build, safe to manage and use going forward? So that's the D part. Now, the next part of that we might consider is the construction element. And this is potentially the most dangerous part of any project. And this comes down to how do we actually deliver the construction of the project safely. And as part of this, we are going to instruct and employ a construction business, a builder of some description, who is going to manage a large part of this process. However, they are still working for you, and because it's your property, ultimately you are still responsible for the safe delivery. So you cannot delegate all of your responsibility to the construction company. They can certainly take on a lot of the responsibility for you, but you are ultimately not in a position to delegate the whole remit down the line to the construction company, to the builder. But clearly, these are the people that need to be able to demonstrate that they can deliver the construction in a safe way. And if you get involved with management of construction projects, which was how I came into all of this a long time ago, you'll know that one of the biggest causes of accidents on construction projects is actually what we call falls from height. So this is falling off things. Now, interestingly enough, the biggest cause of accidents is not falling off a scaffold or anything like that. It's falling off quite low things, steps that have been put up to do quite low level tasks and we're not talking necessarily about serious injury here, but we're talking about sprained ankles and wrists and things like that. So But falling from height is just one of many risks that are on our project, and our construction companies need to be able to manage all of that. And perhaps in respect of falls from heights, perhaps you're aware of properties where people have been working up on the roof, and you've seen them and you thought, oh my word, what happens if they slip a little bit? There's nowhere really that they could go apart from off the roof and into the back garden. And that's of course what we are wanting to avoid, and that's what we as property owners need to avoid, because ultimately the management of safety goes up the line and is ultimately our responsibility. And the responsibility as far as delivering the projects, um, is down to the contractor to demonstrate to you that they are capable of delivering the project safely. And you might say, well, how can I verify that what they've told me is accurate? Well, that's the point, that you need to employ health and safety consultant to do that on your behalf. I'll come back to that a little bit more shortly. And then the third part of CDM stands for M for management. And this is talking very much about, from two perspectives, really, the ongoing management of the building. And I've talked about that with respect to defective light bulbs, but how do we live in the property, and how can we as property owners manage the property in a way that our tenants can live in it safely, and that's reasonably easy to do. Again, we're at grassroots properties. As a property investor, we're not in commercial buildings or anything like that, so that's reasonably straightforward. And as long as we've thought about the design, that should be reasonably okay. But we've also got to consider, from a management perspective, the management of the whole project from start to finish. Who is actually ensuring that the design is right in the first place? And as I've said already, who is actually ensuring that the construction is carried out in a safe way in the first place? So management kind of encompasses both sections and ongoing management as well. And as I say, the whole lot ends up, the buck ultimately stops at the top of the tree, and the top of the tree is the property owner. So you'll know that if you manage a business and you employ multiple people within that business, that you're responsible for everything that they deliver, and everything that they do whilst they're working for you. And one of the things that you're responsible for is their health and safety. If you've ever worked in an office environment, you'll know that there are health and safety consultants, or even in larger companies, health and safety people employed by the business to ensure that everyone who works for the business is safe coming to work. And ultimately, all we're doing now is we're saying that you are the owner of the property in some format or another, and therefore you take that same role as being the owner of a business. You are now the owner of a property, so you take that same role, and the responsibility goes up the line to you. And just to put, be really brutal about this, the worst thing that can happen on any of your projects, the very worst thing, is that someone is killed whilst constructing it, or possibly using it later on. I think the likelihood of someone using it in a way that that would come back to you is much lower likelihood. But in the construction, there could be a reason that someone is actually killed on your project. And going back to my very early years, I had not been working in the construction industry for a year. So this is way back in the 1980s. I hadn't even been on site and working in construction for a year, and someone was actually killed on the site that I was working on, that I was based on. Now, back in those days, these regulations weren't in place. Um, and health and safety was very laissez-faire. It was very laid back. And actually, the person who got killed wasn't actually physically working on the property at the time. He'd finished the work he was doing, and he packed up for the day, and he was walking out of the property, and he walked out of the front door, and above him was a scaffold, and on the scaffold there was someone at high level sweeping up and cleaning up the scaffold, and a tiny little bolt got swept off the scaffold, fell off the scaffold, and unfortunately went 4 stories down and hit the person who was walking home on the head, and unfortunately killed him. So I was made aware of the risks of working on building sites very, very early in my career, to the extent that from that day on, I never ever took a hard hat off when I was working on site. Even now, I'm super cautious walking underneath scaffolds. I won't walk underneath a scaffold without a hard hat on unless I categorically know there's no one up there. I didn't quite learn the hard way. Unfortunately, the worker that was killed learned the hard way, and I learned very, very early on the importance of looking after yourself and looking after the people that are working on your project. So, unfortunately, that could happen on your project. And if you are the owner of that property, health and safety executive will get involved, and alongside many people that they'll want to interview, including the contractor, they will also want to interview you. And if you can't demonstrate that you selected the right contractor, because that could demonstrate to you that they could deliver it safely, then you could be partially held responsible for the injury to the worker on your property. And this is why we need to have a health and safety consultant working alongside us, because that health and safety consultant will be able to vet a contractor for you. The health and safety consultant will be able to ensure that the contractor is able to carry things out safely, that they can demonstrate that they can carry out safely, and indeed they are carrying it out safely. And in that respect, if there is an issue on your particular project, then you can demonstrate that you took every single opportunity to get this right, and you brought in someone to be your eyes and ears and your expert. Then whilst you may still be held slightly responsible, your risk is considerably less. In many ways, bringing in a health and safety consultant is much the same as insuring your car. You're not expecting to drive your car into someone else, into a tree, into a wall, knock someone down. You're not expecting to do it, but you have got insurance just in case you do. And it's exactly the same with employing a health and safety consultant. We are not expecting to injure someone on our project, but if we do, we've got an insurance policy, the health and safety consultant, to help us work through and smooth out the issues that are there and that are going to come from it. So, just as an overview, the CDM regulations basically say there are 6 requirements that we need to adhere to as building owners, as project directors, as project managers. And I use the phrase project managers from a perspective that we are managing from a high level the delivery of this project, which includes, by the way, the design. And we also need to consider ongoing management of properties that we retain. So there's these 6 outlines that we've got to follow. Clearly, within the regulations, there's a lot more detail, but this is the summary. So the first thing is we have to sensibly plan the work so that the risks involved are managed from start to finish. So that's fairly clear, isn't it? And this is the wording straight from the legislation. As I say, it's not written in overly complicated legal speak or anything. But we have to sensibly plan work. So that's the management side of things to a certain extent. And notice that it says so that the risks involved are managed from start to finish. And start is the day that you sit down and start thinking, well, what's the layout of this property? How does this work? But as I say, from a residential property perspective, that we're not doing anything super complicated. So the design side of it is relatively straightforward to deal with. Second part says that you have to have the right people for the job at the right time. Now, from a design perspective, that's about bringing in architects to design, structural engineers to design, where we've got structural things. But from a delivery of the project, the contractor is responsible to ensure that the right person does the right thing. We don't want an inexperienced person putting up structural steel, for instance, because we've got big, heavy steel beams. We want someone putting them up that has done it in the past, can demonstrate that they know how to put it up safely. They know the right plant and equipment to use. And that's the kind of thing that your health and safety consultant will ensure that the builder has got these people, the builder has got the pedigree, and the builder has got the experience to be able to do this work safely. The third thing says that we have to cooperate and coordinate everyone's work. So this is basically saying that we have to have the right people on site at the right time. And we have to ensure that the work that one person's doing is not tripping over the work that someone else is doing. For instance, we don't want to be putting up our steel beam while someone's digging a hole underneath it. This is fairly obvious type stuff, but sadly, it gets overlooked sometimes. So this isn't necessarily something that you're going to be ultimately responsible for on a day-to-day basis, but you need to ensure that the contractor you engage who is going to be responsible for this on a day-to-day basis is actually capable of delivering this. Now, clearly, if you're managing your own projects, if you're acting as the foreman on site, then this absolutely, the buck stops with you. And this is where you need to be very careful, because if the buck stops with you and you haven't got a health and safety consultant advising you, then ultimately you are responsible for anything that goes on. And this, to some extent, is why I always recommend that you engage a general contractor, a general builder to carry out your work, rather than acting the role of working foreman and manage individual tradesmen. Because by bringing in a general contractor, you have already delegated some of the health and safety responsibility to another party. The fourth part of the regulation says you have to have the right information about the risks and how they are being managed. So we have to understand the risks. We have to understand what are low, medium, and high risks as part of delivering our project. Now, again, if we've delegated the whole thing out and instructed a general contractor, they can do this, and they're more than able to do it. However, they need to be verified to a certain extent that they have actually got the capability of delivering it safely, and that the documentation they give to you actually makes sense and demonstrates that they can deliver it safely. And this is where you would have a health and safety consultant to verify all of that for you. Number 5 is that we have to communicate all information effectively to those that need to know. So we've one day on our project, we decide that we've got to take up the floor behind the front door, for instance, because it's all rotted, and we're going to take it all up. So we're going to close off the front door because right behind it there's now a missing floor, and we're going to tell everyone that they've got to come in the back door. So who is responsible for ensuring that no one actually opens the front door whilst there's nothing behind it and there's a big hole behind it? And that ultimately, normally that responsibility goes to the builder. But this is why builders don't want you walking around the project in the evening. If you didn't know about that, you could open that front door on a dark night and fall straight down into the basement. The builder and everyone on site knew about it, but the builder hadn't necessarily told you. So this is why you should never go to site without the builder being there, or at least telling the builder that you're going, so that there's an opportunity for them to communicate to you where the risks are. And risks on projects change at different times. I'm sure you've had projects where the builders have said, look, don't come to site on that particular day, because that's the day all the steel's being delivered and there'll be people everywhere and it's hard to manage the safety on that day. So I don't really want someone else there on that day. That wouldn't be an unreasonable thing to do. That's the builder communicating information to effectively manage the safety on the site on that day. And then the sixth part says we have to consult and engage with workers about the risks and how they are being managed. Effectively, we have to ensure that our workers have got a forum to tell us that things aren't safe. Now, most of the time, you won't get involved with that, because that is at grassroots, where the workers, the tradesmen, are employed by a building company, and they will obviously forward that up the line through their business. So you don't need to worry about that too much. But you can see here that we've got these 6 responsibilities that ultimately stop with us, by and large can be outsourced to other people. But the one person who looks after our interests is the health and safety consultant. You might hear those health and safety consultants refer to themselves as CDM consultants as well. Effectively, they're doing the same role. CDM consultants are 100% dedicated towards delivering construction projects, whereas you will find health and safety consultants are a little bit more broad brush. They've got expertise and experience in in other elements of health and safety beyond just construction. So most of the time, you'd look for a construction-based, construction-focused health and safety consultant that, as I say, you may well find themselves called CDM consultants as well. So not intending to go into any more depth than this, apart from to summarize and just reinforce what I've said a few times here, is the buck stops with you. You are at the top of the pyramid. You're at the top of the tree as the owner of the property. So ultimately, you need to take responsibility for the safe delivery, the safe construction, the safe design, the safe management of your properties. And because the likelihood is that you don't have the expertise to undertake the whole role yourself, you are going to need to engage with a CDM health and safety consultant that can sit alongside you and help you deliver the project safely. And my advice would be to speak to a health and safety consultant nice and early on, and have a proper discussion with them about exactly what their obligations are, exactly what their service would be to you. And they will go into what I've been talking about in a bit more depth, and that they'll help you understand what they can do, what they need to do to look after your interests in the longer term. So, as I said at the start, I'm not qualified to give you health and safety guidance. I can unpack the regulations and give you a broad overview, which is what I've aimed to do here. What you really need to do is take some advice from a health and safety consultant to ensure that if the worst happens, you are covered. And that's kind of the summary of this podcast. So yeah, just think about that when you're planning your next projects. Just consider that and factor that in as an indication. The cost of a CDM health and safety consultant on a lot of our fairly run-of-the-mill type projects will probably be less than or very close to £1,000. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot of cost at all. The cost could go up if you've got a more complex project, if the team are not particularly experienced. And the cost will definitely go up because you tend to pay on a pay-as-you-go basis if there are problems later on down the line. But those problems later on down the line, the health and safety consultant will come into their own and look after your interests and protect you as best they can. And just to close this off, in the worst case scenario, this failure to get this right could lead, in a worst case scenario, I said, to a custodial sentence, and none of us want that to happen. So take care, look after yourself, look after everyone who's working on your projects, take some advice from a health and safety consultant, and please deliver your projects safely.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please do like, share, and leave a comment where you can. If you need any guidance or advice with anything to do with your refurbishments or conversions, then don't hesitate to reach out. You can book a free call with me by clicking on the link at the top of my website, refurbishmentmastery.com. There's other ways you can contact me in the show notes as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.